The history of the world is a history of names. Thousands of years of names. Countries, cities, individuals. The names of champions and mass murderers, rulers and revolutionaries, scholars and frauds. They punctuate the pages of human history. And inside this list of names, there is a smaller, more select roll of honour. On it are those people whose actions have so shaped the world, for good or bad, that their names have become instantly recognisable. Julius Caesar and Genghis Khan, Adolf Hitler and John F. Kennedy, Albert Einstein, Aristotle, Muhammad, Mahatma Gandhi. But there is one individual whose name has become more familiar than any other. Jesus Christ, the man who claimed to have defeated death. Jesus of Nazareth, a Jewish carpenter who spent only 3 years in the public eye. Homeless, uneducated, and eventually executed as a criminal. Yet for 2 millennia, the world has hung on his every word. One historian has written,
"No revolution that has ever taken place in society can be compared to that which has been produced by the words of Jesus."
His teachings have inspired the greatest acts of kindness and been twisted to justify the bloodiest acts of tyranny. Who was Jesus? What did he really stand for? The writers of the Bible present us with a life free of faults and filled with astonishing acts of compassion. But it's not his personal morality or the mercy he bestowed on others for which Jesus is chiefly remembered. Jesus is called the Christ by millions because of his seemingly miraculous powers, specifically his power over death. In his lifetime, Jesus was supposed to have raised at least 3 people from the dead, 2 men and a young girl. But it wasn't these exploits that earned him the reverence of hundreds of millions. Jesus stands out from every other teacher and healer in history because he is reported to have raised himself from the dead.
Belief in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ has powered the church for almost 2 millennia. His faithful followers have taken the teachings of this first-century Jew to the farthest corners of the world, making him arguably the most famous person to have ever lived. But Jesus' incredible life is inseparably entwined with his brutal execution and the claim that he returned from the dead. His resurrection is the cornerstone of the Christian faith. The Bible states that Jesus' resurrection guarantees his followers' acceptance by God and their safe passage into a heavenly afterlife. But how secure is this cornerstone? Can the resurrection hope to withstand the sort of questions the 21st century would raise? Could the evidence for Jesus rising from the dead stand up in a court of law? Would it crumble under the examination of modern medical science? In short, could the resurrection hope to survive an encounter with the rational mind?
So how was your tube?
Disaster.
What's up?
I've got exactly 48 hours to prove that not all dead people have stayed dead.
I'm sorry, I think you lost me somewhere at the bag thing.
Look, to complete one of my law subjects, I've got to take part in a debate. The topic is that Jesus Christ survived the crucifixion. Guess who got the affirmative case?
I thought you were doing some debate on the existence of aliens or something.
Well, I was until some bright spark in class suggested a change of topic.
So how are you going to prove that?
Well, They gave me this, and I got a whole lot of historical stuff and all the caffeine we've got in the kitchen.
Great shot. Fantastic shot, Jeff.
Most people find something to admire in the character of Jesus of Nazareth. His hometown draws tens of thousands of tourists every year. But the biblical accounts of Jesus' life leave most modern readers with an uneasy feeling because of their reference to miraculous events. As the French philosopher Rousseau put it,
"Get rid of the miracles and the whole world will fall at the feet of Jesus."
but his miracles are the events which set him apart, that ultimately make him such an intriguing character. Visitors to the modern state of Israel find the echoes of Jesus' extraordinary life at every turn. The Mount of Olives still affords the best view of the ancient city of Jerusalem. The Gospels record Jesus reaching a similar vantage point and predicting the destruction of the city in 70 AD by the armies of the Roman general Titus. A full-scale model of the city as it looked in the 1st century shows tourists other points of interest in the Jesus story. The temple colonnade, where Jesus is reported to have declared himself to be the Christ. The temple was also the site where many came to Jesus to be healed of their sicknesses. The pool of Bethesda is where Jesus is said to have healed a man who had been an invalid for 38 years. Or the pool of Siloam, where Jesus sent a man born blind to wash and receive his sight. Jesus also told his disciples on many occasions that Jerusalem was the city where he would be tried, executed, and buried, and where he would physically rise from the dead 3 days later.
Christ was resuscitated, that is, brought back to life. But more than that, he was resurrected in the sense that his whole person was transformed for the age to come, so that he is a kind of pledge for us of our hope for the future. And if that is something that didn't happen historically, then Jesus is just a man, really. There were no shortage of prophets around, failed prophets. Well, if Jesus said, "I am going to be raised again on the 3rd day," which he did, and if it didn't happen, then his prophecy hasn't come true. He's just another failed prophet.
The details of Jesus' life are supplied for us by 4 ancient biographies. These books are named after their authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Within the church, they're referred to as the Gospels, an ancient Greek word for good news. These Gospels provide the primary evidence for the resurrection. They contain a record of the events leading up to the arrest, the execution, the burial, and the supposed rising of Jesus. But do they help or hinder the case for the resurrection? What sort of credibility do they have in the eyes of modern historians? Any examination of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth has to begin with an examination of the documents that claim to record this extraordinary event. What sort of documents are these Gospels? Are they reliable historical sources?
Well, with the Gospels, you're not simply dealing with one book. You're dealing with 4 books, written at least partially independently. Mark's Gospel is almost certainly written first. Matthew has used Mark for some of his material, but has got material from other places. Likewise, Luke. Luke has used Mark for some of his material, but has also got information from other places. And the consensus of scholarship is that John's Gospel, probably written later, hasn't used any of the others. So we have 3 partially independent sources and one other completely independent source of information. The real question is, are they documents that a historian can use? And there the answer is simply yes. Like other ancient documents, they present problems for a historian, but they are nonetheless documents that a historian can use, can make use of, can deal with critically, but with some confidence that they've got evidence that they can get at. There's a certain amount of archaeological evidence that locks in with the framework of the Gospel stories. Two well-known cases are the so-called pavement on which Pilate gave judgments in Jerusalem. Now that particular archaeological site has been found and is well known, so the Gospels aren't set in fantasy land, they're set in places that archaeologists have actually seen and worked on.
Examining artefacts is one way of checking the credentials of the Gospels. Another is comparing their accounts with other historical records. That consideration shifts our attention 50 kilometres south of Jerusalem to the ancient Jewish fortress of Masada.
Masada has been a site of archaeological interest for decades. Handheld picks and brushes uncovering the secrets of the centuries. But when historians try to understand what went on here so many years ago, they also sift the records left behind by the writers of the time. Many turn to Flavius Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian who provides us with the most detailed accounts of the Masada campaign. We've learned to trust Josephus' eyes when we look into the past at the Roman-Jewish struggle. But Josephus doesn't just tell us about Masada. He's a non-Christian historian who also confirms key elements of the Christian story.
Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day.
There are certainly a number of other Greco-Roman authors who make brief mentions of Jesus, or at least make mentions that almost certainly refer to Jesus. But they don't actually tell us very much. There's a passage in Josephus which, though it was doctored by early Christians in about the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th century, monks who apparently couldn't stand Josephus saying something like, this man claimed to be the Messiah, and doctored it so it said, this man was the Messiah. But it's pretty clear that Josephus did mention Jesus and said things about him being a famous teacher and probably also being known as a wonder worker.
So Jesus' existence and various events in his life can be confirmed by historical sources other than the Bible. This would appear to be a point in favour of the Gospels. But establishing the authenticity of the Gospels does not prove the honesty of their authors.
So how's it going?
I'm trying to figure out what to do when the opposition start tearing apart my version of events.
Won't they be cowering before your devastating intellect?
And yeah, well, once they've stopped cowering.
How about you use the word objection a lot? Or I know, bring in some surprise witnesses.
Problem is, according to this, my best witness is currently in heaven. Apparently he's due back soon, but it doesn't say when.
So have you got any others?
Plenty. Family, friends, civil servants. There's even a doctor in here somewhere.
So what's the problem?
Well, how can I put this? Each of the witnesses, they're all a few sandwiches short of a picnic.
Why?
You're the medical student, Amy. Sure you've covered the topic of death by now. If someone dies, they stay dead. The only person who's ever been able to avoid death is Elvis.
So do they seem to be lying or mad?
In many ways, the Gospels have a lot in common with legal statements that can be submitted as evidence to a modern court. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John's accounts contain statements from people who claim they witnessed the resurrection. So what do legal experts make of the quality of their testimony?
The Gospel accounts are very honest. For example, they talk warts and all about the writers and about the disciples, and they even talk warts and all about Jesus. They don't hide the fact that he did not get on with the religious leaders. They are very open, non-biased accounts.
Several modern scholars believe they have detected inconsistencies in the Gospel accounts of Jesus' trial, death and resurrection. But lawyers suggest what appear to be weaknesses in the case of the resurrection can actually turn out to be strengths.
Differences are important in accounts because they show you there is no collusion. If people get in a witness box and tell the same story exactly in the same way, then you think, hey, they've got together on this. But when they bring their own little emphasis, you think, wow, I mean, this is significant. For example, Luke alone records that Jesus healed the ear of the high priest's servant that Peter cut off. Now, we know Luke was a doctor. That's an incredible account, showing that it's really Luke's touch, and it just happened so naturally. But no other gospel records that. That's not inconsistency, that's reliability.
The gospel writers give every evidence of making what they believe to be an honest record of the events they and others witnessed. But what about the main event, Jesus rising from the dead? Surely common sense rules out the accuracy of their testimony, however honest they were in recording it. The idea of someone defying the most fundamental fact about life is hard to entertain. But legally speaking, the case for proving the resurrection does not rest on proving that a resurrection is possible. It all comes down to a simple equation. One lawyer put it this way:
the legal evidence required to prove Jesus' resurrection is twofold. Firstly, one must prove that Jesus Christ was dead beyond resuscitation at point A. Secondly, it must be shown that he was alive at point B.
If someone is truly dead at point A and alive at point B, the only possible conclusion is resurrection.
But this is where many historians believe the conspiracy begins. Did Jesus actually die on that cross approximately 2,000 years ago? Or are there more human explanations for his reappearance 3 days later? The gospel accounts of Jesus' trial, death, and resurrection may be accurate. But some modern-day scholars believe they leave enough room for an alternative explanation, that Jesus actually survived his trial and apparent execution. Is this true? Can the historical evidence be interpreted in such a way that it allows for the possibility of Jesus' survival? All four gospel writers record that Jesus was treated roughly by his enemies from the moment he was arrested on the Thursday night before the Jewish Passover. The mob that arrested Jesus bound him and took him to the high priest's home. During this first trial, he was struck several times by his accusers, spat upon, and eventually blindfolded and beaten by the guards. After a sleepless night, Jesus was handed over to the governor of Jerusalem, Pontius Pilate, for the Roman part of his trial. Jesus was subjected to a forced march across the city when Pilate referred his case to King Herod Antipas. He was eventually returned to Pilate, who handed down the death penalty and had him flogged. This punishment usually left the flesh of a person's back in ribbons. All four gospel authors record that Jesus was then handed over to the Roman garrison as a plaything. He was dressed up as a king and a crown of thorns forced onto his head. The soldiers then took turns striking him about the head and face with a wooden staff. The torment over, Jesus was led outside the city walls to be crucified.
The Romans had been using crucifixion as a means for execution for centuries, but not for Roman citizens. Roman citizens, if they were to be executed, were beheaded, which is at least quicker. Crucifixion is a pretty awful way to die and can take days, even as much as a week. But the Romans did use crucifixion for rebels or runaway slaves, and after the great slave revolt of Spartacus in 70 BC, for example, they captured and then crucified 30,000 runaway slaves along the main highway out of Rome. Can you just imagine 30,000 people up there on crosses taking days and days to die? It's theatre of terror. It's a spectacle to remind people what happens to rebels.
The Biblical Resources Centre, based in Jerusalem, displays a number of the types of crosses employed by the Romans. The wooden constructs differed depending on the availability of materials or the site of the crucifixion. It was customary for the condemned person to carry their own cross to their place of execution. Matthew, Mark and Luke record that Jesus was so weak by this stage that the soldiers had to force a bystander to carry his cross for him. When the execution party reached the hill of Golgotha, Jesus was stripped naked and nailed hand and foot to the wooden cross. After hours of abuse, Jesus was finally crucified at approximately 9 a.m. on the Friday morning.
G'day, Steve. We're going down the shops. Do you want us to get anything for you?
A forensic specialist and about 12 litres of blood.
Would you like any fries with that, sir?
What are you doing?
I thought I might try and show that Jesus didn't die in the first place. That way it's a cinch to show he was alive after his date with the Romans.
And how about the blood?
Well, I'm trying to work out how long he could have lasted with the wounds he received before needing medical attention. He wasn't on the cross that long.
It doesn't matter. You don't die of blood loss when you're being crucified.
Sorry?
I read it in a journal. You die of suffocation and exhaustion.
Sure, blood loss would have been too easy.
The Gospel of John contains one strange detail relating to Jesus' crucifixion. Responding to requests from the religious leaders, the Roman soldiers were ordered to break the legs of the prisoners they had crucified.
Why did they break prisoners' legs when they were being crucified? Yes, it does seem a bit superfluous, doesn't it, once you've nailed them up? Well, the answer is they didn't normally break their legs. Crucifixion kills you by asphyxiation. Your whole weight is hanging on the muscles of your chest, and so you really can't breathe. Or at least you can only breathe by pushing up against the nail through your feet, which is a pretty horrifying sort of concept. But it means that people do take a long time to die. Now, in Jesus' case, it was right on the eve of the great Passover festival, which is one of the most important festivals in the Jewish calendar, and having people dead or dying on the Passover would have been a serious offence to Jewish sensibilities. So the governor, or the soldiers, we don't really know which, decided that they had to die quickly, get it over with, get the bodies down, and don't offend the sensibilities of the people. So they went to smash their legs, which means A, terrible shock, and B, you can no longer push yourself up to relieve the stress on your chest, and you just plain die much more quickly.
However, the Roman soldiers did not end up breaking Jesus' legs. When they came to his cross, they discovered that he was already dead. But just to make sure, they took a spear and pushed it up into his chest cavity. John states that he saw this happen and records that blood and water flowed from the wound in Jesus' side.
Now, what most medical people think that means is clotted dark dried blood or drying blood and light fluid serum, which would look like water. And if your blood has clotted and out comes clotted blood and serum, you're dead. You've in fact been dead for more than an hour.
The Roman soldiers weren't the only ones surprised to find that Jesus of Nazareth had died so quickly. Mark's account records that Governor Pilate asked for a special report from the centurion in charge of the execution. It was only after Pilate received confirmation Jesus was dead that he was prepared to release his body for burial. Jesus' corpse was given to Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish ruling council who'd voted against the plan to have him executed. Joseph had the body wrapped in strips of linen and placed in his own tomb because it happened to be close by. Historians have argued for centuries over the precise location of Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. One popular suggestion is known as Gordon's Calvary. The ancient tomb discovered here attracts thousands of tourists every year because of its similarity to the biblical descriptions of Jesus' burial place. Joseph's tomb was set in a garden. It was carved out of solid rock, and the entrance was sealed by means of a large stone that would require the effort of several people to move. But the mainstream churches have traditionally accepted a different site for Jesus' last resting place. The remains of this tomb now lie under Jerusalem's Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, traditionally the site of Jesus' death, burial and resurrection. It's also the site of many of the controversies surrounding his apparent rising from the dead, particularly the famous swoon theory. Let's examine the historical evidence together and look for a logical conclusion.
The swoon theory is one of the oldest Easter conspiracy theories. It's been advanced by academics like Venturini, Thiering and Ludemann. Basically, it suggests that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. He survived his treatment at the hands of the religious authorities, Pilate, and the Roman soldiers on the Friday. When the guards came to check if he was still alive, Jesus seemed to be dead, but was actually unconscious. He had swooned. Later, he revived in the coolness of the tomb. It was then a simple matter for him to unbandage himself, remove the stone at the entrance, and sneak away without being seen. And on the Sunday, Jesus reappeared and went about convincing people he had risen from the dead.
The swoon theory is an unlikely explanation. Those who advocate just refuse to believe that miracles can happen in history. They come from that position. So what do? It can't be resurrection. They can't dismiss the historical reliability of the account of him on the cross, so they create the swoon theory. The skeptic of yesterday, Strauss, said the swoon theory is a greater miracle than the resurrection itself. I mean, this guy's on a cross, he has a spear in his side, he's put in a tomb, and a couple of days later, he jumps out as if he's 101%. Couldn't be.
The evidence points to Jesus dying on the cross. The records also indicate the religious authorities of the time were determined to make sure the body of Jesus stayed in its tomb. Matthew notes they gained permission from Governor Pilate to place a guard on the grave to prevent anyone stealing the body. They also placed seals on the entrance stone to ensure it remained undisturbed. But for all their precautions, something went wrong. Authors have been developing alternative explanations for the apparent resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth for centuries. Several theories revolve around the idea of mistaken identity. The Quran, the holy book of the Islamic faith, suggests that the Romans crucified the wrong man. But it seems unlikely the religious leaders who'd arranged Jesus' arrest and were present at his trial and execution would have made such an obvious blunder. But the question of mistaken identity doesn't have to end there. What about the people who claim to have seen Jesus alive after his execution? Could they have been talking to an impostor? The body of Jesus of Nazareth was entombed late on the Friday afternoon. The guards placed by the religious authorities ensured it remained undisturbed all through Saturday. But on the Sunday morning, several women who'd been travelling with Jesus arrived at the tomb to complete the funeral arrangements. What they claim to have discovered is an empty tomb with the entrance stone rolled away. All four Gospel writers record that an angel appeared to the women and informed them that Jesus had risen from the dead. Theorists like Kersop and Lake suggest a more practical explanation. They believe the women simply went to the wrong tomb. Janine Jones is a journalist who has independently researched the evidence for the resurrection on site in Israel. She focuses the inquiring mind of the modern media on the evidence provided by the women.
Janine, what's so significant about the women appearing in the Gospel accounts as witnesses?
Well, I think it's surprising that the Gospel records that the women were witnesses. You see, if you were going to fabricate a story, you wouldn't choose women to actually give an eyewitness account of the resurrection.
Why is that?
Women weren't, they didn't have the same status as women do today, of course, in the 1st century, and a women's testimony wasn't valid in a court of law. So if you wanted your story to be credible, I think you would choose someone like Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus, who were sympathetic to Jesus and who had a standing in the Jewish community as members of the Sanhedrin and knowledgeable in the law.
How good is the testimony that the women provide?
I think it's very valuable. I think it's reliable. They were there, they witnessed his journey to Golgotha as he carried his cross. They witnessed his suffering on the cross, his death, him being taken down from the cross, and they would have known where the tomb was, where Joseph of Arimathea's tomb was. That's where he was laid. That's where they went to anoint his body. And of course, that's where they were when they witnessed the resurrection. So they have an unbroken account of the time of Jesus' death to the time of Jesus' resurrection.
The most obvious alternative explanation to the women finding an empty tomb is that someone stole Jesus' body. But this suggestion runs into the problem of motive.
Who would have taken the body? The religious leaders? The Roman authorities? They didn't want this story out there. They didn't take the body. The disciples? Why would they take the body? Totally contrary to the teachings of Jesus. And in the end, they died for this. So if they had taken the body, they wouldn't have allowed their own lives to be sacrificed for it.
The Gospels document no less than 12 separate occasions on which the risen Jesus appeared to people. Mark and Luke record that on the Sunday in question, 2 of Jesus' disciples were travelling through the countryside on their way from Jerusalem to the town of Emmaus. They claim to have been met by the risen Jesus, who walked and talked with them for a considerable period of time. He then vanished, and they returned to Jerusalem to inform the rest of his disciples. Luke notes that when they returned, they found the others discussing how Jesus had already appeared to one of his chief disciples, Simon Peter. While they were comparing notes, Mark, Luke and John agree that Jesus appeared in the room. The witnesses were initially terrified, believing they were seeing some spiritual apparition. But Jesus proved his physical presence by inviting them to touch him and then by eating a meal. Jesus continued to meet with his disciples on several other occasions over the next few weeks. Individual meetings with cynics like his brother James, public appearances for the sake of skeptics like longtime follower Thomas. The most startling occasion recorded involved a prolonged meeting with more than 500 people. The Gospel accounts show that Jesus' disciples were amongst the hardest people to convince. John records Jesus eventually had to appear to Peter and several other disciples on the shores of Lake Galilee and spur them on to tell people about his resurrection.
I've been reading these pages over and over again, and I'm sick and tired of trying to come up with an explanation as to why a dead guy is suddenly walking around alive, the other side of a crooked judge and a lynch mob with too much time on their hands. I mean, the witnesses, they're also consistent. There's nothing to work with here. I mean, as far as they're concerned, it's either resurrection or nothing.
Just ignore them. Usually works for me. It's not like anyone saw him rise from the dead anyway.
Yeah, except there were these guys who reckon they saw him alive afterwards, and there's this empty tomb. I mean, it's pretty much the same thing.
Mate, they were his friends. They were counting on him coming back.
Yeah, sure. I guess they were, except for those who didn't like him and those who weren't expecting him to come back.
Mate, they were probably all dreaming. I mean, he wasn't around that long. How long was he around for?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Darren. Now all I've got to do is make 1 month seem like a short period of time.
The appearances of Jesus, I think, are credible, at least to me, because they involve several of our senses, or several of the senses of the people at the time. They saw him, the eyes were involved. They heard him, the ears were involved. They actually put their hands on him, so their senses were involved in that the tactile bodily sense, and they ate with him. So, I mean, they are the usual indicators by which people relate to one another. We see, we hear, we shake hands, we have a meal together. That's why we know we are dealing with a real human being and not a phantom or a ghost or a spook or something like that.
Lake Galilee is just one of the many sites where the risen Jesus is supposed to have met with his disciples. In total, close to 600 people claim to have met with him over a period of 40 days. In his last appearance, Jesus returned to heaven from a hillside just outside of Jerusalem. Jesus' religious opponents suggested the resurrection story was a conspiracy constructed by the disciples. If it was, then it's one of the most elaborate hoaxes of all time.
When he died on the cross, they were bitterly disappointed and broken-hearted people. They thought that he was going to bring in the kingdom of God or something like that. And so they are crestfallen, they are disappointed, their bottom has fallen out of their world. So emotionally and psychologically, I do not see them saying, oh, well, let's make up a story about resurrection. I don't think they're in the emotional state of mind to do that.
It's hard to refute the evidence that Jesus of Nazareth died on a Roman cross outside the walls of Jerusalem. But the mystery of his death deepens the more it's examined. What of the witnesses to the risen Jesus? Some have suggested that there is a psychological explanation for his apparent rising from the dead. Some authors, attempting to explain the apparent resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, have suggested a different sort of conspiracy. A conspiracy of the mind. Theorists like Bishop Spong believe the witnesses saw Jesus because they wanted to see him. But this explanation has met with stiff opposition.
People say the disciples were hallucinating, and hallucination can take place. But over 500 people saw Jesus at one time. 500 people can't hallucinate about the same event at the same time. We're all different personalities. Hallucination doesn't happen that way. Your hallucination will be different from mine. This cannot be hallucination. It doesn't pass the test of hallucination.
Furthermore, critics of the hallucination theory point out that witnesses had no basis for even imagining something as unexpected as a resurrection.
Well, believing in the physical resurrection of Jesus was a pretty difficult thing to do in the ancient world as it is in the modern world. We know, for example, that most Jews would think the idea that someone could have been raised from the dead in the middle of history rather than at the end of time was simply bizarre. It was a little bit like saying, well, the end of the world has come a bit. Resurrection should be what happens at the end of time, not somewhere in what we now call 33 AD.
They were not expecting the resurrection of an individual. Indeed, Jesus spoke about his own resurrection beforehand, but as we read the Gospels, it's very clear that they simply didn't understand what he was talking about. It was just double Dutch as far as they were concerned.
This new belief in Jesus' resurrection appears to have had a unifying effect on his early followers. The Jewish temple, reconstructed and enlarged by Herod the Great, became a focal point for Jesus' disciples. Individuals who'd once been terrified of execution began to proclaim loudly that Jesus rose from the dead.
I think that's the most impressive thing about Jesus' resurrection. It's not that he just appeared to people, but that his appearance made a radical impact on people's lives. And so it changed people's ways of thinking, it changed people's lives.
Oh, there's no question that the resurrection was a foundational belief for the early Christians. It's mentioned numerous times in the earliest Christian documents, which are not the Gospels. The earliest Christian documents are the letters of St. Paul. He mentions the death and resurrection of Jesus numerous times. It's mentioned through the Gospels. It's mentioned in every New Testament document.
The New Testament also records that the religious authorities banned preaching about Jesus. His followers in Jerusalem underwent incredible persecution. But instead of vanishing, the church thrived.
The disciples were absolutely convinced that Christ was raised from the dead. This was at the centre of all of their preaching and teaching. Certainly they believed that in his death, Christ brought about the forgiveness of our sins for those who believe in him.
Widespread persecution of the Christian faith broke out in the Roman Empire during the reign of Emperor Nero. Tradition holds that the two key leaders of the early church, the apostles Peter and Paul, were both martyred in Rome around AD 67 as a result of their persistent preaching. But rather than retreat from their beliefs, the early Christians enshrined them. Ancient texts from the 2nd century churches demonstrate that the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ remained as important as ever.
We have very clear evidence from the early 2nd century as to what happened to Christians who clung to their beliefs when threatened by the Roman government. Pliny the Elder, who was the governor of northern coastal Turkey around about 113 AD, corresponds with the Roman Emperor Trajan about how precisely to handle these cases. And the procedure they agreed on was this: ask them formally 3 times, are they a Christian? That gives them time to change their minds. If they say, yes, they are, then they are taken away for execution, unless they're Roman citizens, in which case they are formally tried in Rome and then executed if they stand by their beliefs. For the non-Roman citizens, well, it might be beheading, or it might be being thrown to the wild beasts in the arena, or it could be anything. It could be pretty awful, but the death penalty is the death penalty, and Christianity was in this period an illegal religion and a capital offence.
Now, that brings us to one of the more powerful circumstantial proofs for the resurrection. People who'd publicly claimed to have seen Jesus alive after his crucifixion were prepared to face terrible torture and horrific deaths rather than make the simple retraction that would have set them free. Hardly the sort of behaviour you'd expect from people who'd woven a complex tissue of lies to cover up the death of their teacher.
Christians who visit these ancient sites today are a living testimony to the persisting conviction that Jesus rose from the dead. They believe Jesus' resurrection proves he is God and confirms his authority to forgive sins.
The power of God that raised Christ from the dead is still brought to bear on people, men and women and boys and girls, who in a simple but real and straightforward way put their personal trust in Christ. When people do that, lives are changed. Now those lives are not simply changed just by emotion or some psychological process or something like that. That change of life, that change of attitude, that lifting of the darkness within so that people have light and truth within their lives, that is a change that is brought about by the power that raised Christ from the dead. And so there's a sense in which every time a person is truly born again or truly converted, as it were, we have a new resurrection.
So have you got everything you need?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by need. I've got more than enough material for 10 debates on Jesus rising from the dead, but I think I picked up a few other things as well.
Such as?
Well, an uneasy feeling, strong desire for a drink, and I think I'm going to have a chat with a mate of mine who's a Christian.
So where you go?
Well, the pubs are closed. I think we'll go and chat to my mate.
Fantastic! The goal.
Good luck.
Did Jesus rise from the dead? Yes? No? Who cares? Well, no one, if we treat his death and resurrection like just another historical fact, to be noted, filed, and forgotten. But if you've been swayed to think that he did rise from the dead, something he predicted he would do, then you owe it to yourself to think carefully about everything else he had to say. A man who claims to be the Son of God might be a liar. But what if he backed up his claims by rising from the dead? A man who informs people that those who trust in him will live on, even though they die, could be considered a lunatic. But what if he demonstrated his power to defeat the grave? Jesus claimed to be the Lord of all, the Christ, the only one God would send to fix our broken relationship with him. And Jesus presented his rising from the dead as his credentials.